One of the enduring questions for sharing the gospel with the world that began in the time of the Apostle Paul and still lasts to this day is, are we working with or are we working against the culture of the people that we are trying to share the gospel with? And we've seen a variety of responses to this in the history of missions. One thing that has happened in some places is called syncretism, the idea of taking the gospel and sort of blending it with the local religion. In the two most familiar ways that has happened in your experience, you've probably heard of both of these, would be Santeria in Cuba and Voodoo in Haiti. They're actually the same thing. They're a blend of the gospel with a particular African religion. Another example would be when the Jesuits went to China in the 16th and 17th century. They came to China, and in order to share the gospel, they decided that their priests should dress as Confucian scholars, because that is a revered figure in that time period in China. They had great success, 250,000 converts with only 75 priests. But when the Dominicans and Franciscans showed up in the 18th century, they bitterly opposed this idea of accommodating the Chinese culture. And in 1704, the Pope at the time condemned the Jesuits for being willing to work with the local culture. When Hudson Taylor, and that's his picture on the right, arrived in China and founded China Inland Mission, in the 19th century, a Protestant missionary, he learned from the Jesuits, and he and all of his missionaries dressed like the locals, not like a Westerner. So what is the line between accommodation, which means meeting people where they are with the gospel, we go to where they are, and abdication, which would be changing the gospel to fit where people want it to be? One is good, the other is bad. In the right, dropping my notes, that's helpful. Book of Corinthians, chapter 9, where we left off from before, beginning in verse 19, Paul is going to talk about his experience with this very notion. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible." Now, Paul considered himself to be free on a variety of levels. Number one, of course, he was freed personally by Jesus Christ, freed from being a slave to sin, free from being someone who is trying to keep the law through his hard work and his dedication, free from the pride that had kept him in chains. So then he was free to be the man that God had made him to be. He was a Jewish Roman citizen. That's who he was. That's the person that he was. He also was an ex-Pharisee turned apostle to the Gentiles. This man had an interesting history. He was free to be that person, but he was also free to be obligated to Jesus Christ. He was free to serve those who needed the gospel. So he says, I have made myself a slave to everyone. Not I have become or not I was forced to. It was a conscious decision on the part of the Apostle Paul. He developed a plan, a tactic, a strategy, probably with talking with other Christians, reading the scriptures, doing all the things that he needed to do to figure out how he could become the person that would be more effective with sharing the gospel than he would have been had he remained in that little niche as a Roman citizen Jew, ex-Pharisee turned Gentile apostle. That's a very tight niche, right? That's a specific person. But he decided to broaden his approach and his appeal, and he made that decision. He says, I'm a slave to everyone. That doesn't mean he was trying to meet their physical needs. Of course, we can and should meet the physical needs of those in need. That's what Christian charity is all about. But Paul said, I'm going to go beyond that. I'm not going to worry just about their physical needs. I'm going to think about their psychological needs, about their emotional needs. And I'm going to humble myself to the extent that I will deal with those needs as well for the sake of the gospel. Notice the end of the sentence, to win as many as possible. We'll look at verse 23 in a bit and see why Paul cares about that, but the how is the important question here. How is Paul going to go about this? And he's actually going to give us examples of what he did in order to fit this theory, in order to make this a reality. Here's the first one. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. Now, that's an interesting statement from the Apostle Paul. I just got done telling you he was an ex-Pharisee. He was a Jew. He was actually a Benjamite from the tribe of Benjamin. He was raised in an extremely observant home from all we can understand. He received extensive, high-level, serious religious training. And he took that extra step of becoming a Pharisee. So you're asking yourself, how can Paul become like a Jew when Paul is a par excellence Jew? It doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about, Paul? And that helps us to understand where he's going with this. Paul said that when I am working with my fellow Jews, when I am in their home, when I am talking to them, when I'm meeting to them, preaching to them, I observe and respect all the Jewish cultural and religious customs that I certainly know from my own experience. This is probably the easiest one for Paul to do because he's just stepping back into who he was before. Some of those customs, some of those cultural things he no longer observes for himself. He doesn't necessarily list all of those for us, but he doesn't keep the Sabbath like he used to. He doesn't keep kosher like he used to. A lot of the things that he used to do, he no longer does when he's working with Gentiles. But when he's working with his fellow Jews, he says, I'll put that back on. I'm going to do that again for their sake. He says, to those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. This is a second reference to that same group of people, to the Jewish people, perhaps having more to do with the law of Moses in particular, like the idea of keeping kosher, than those cultural things that are not part of the law. Let me give you an example. A modern day example. How would you do this? You go to lunch with someone who is Jewish, that you know is religiously observant Jewish, right? Someone who actually goes to synagogue, who takes the law seriously. You go to lunch with them. What don't you order? A ham sandwich, right? It's a little thing. They keep kosher, and so when I'm eating lunch with them, I won't order ham today. It's not a big sacrifice. It just takes a little bit of thinking to do that. Now, you also wouldn't do the exact same thing if you were sitting down to lunch with a Muslim, right? You wouldn't order ham there either. They don't eat it too. It's just thinking about that kind of stuff. If you went with that friend to the synagogue for a service, you would wear the yarmulke if you're a man. It's not a big deal to you, but it's showing respect to them so that they might listen to you. Paul knew that showing respect, that accommodating the feelings of those that he was professing to care about, was not an admission that the practice in question is somehow binding. When he observed kosher when he was with Jews, it didn't mean that that law was once again upon him. That's why he says, I'm not under the law. I'm not doing it for that. I'm doing it for them. Those kinds of efforts in the mind of the Apostle Paul are not compromises. His critics might have called them compromises, but Paul said, no, it's not a compromise. His critics might have said that you are caving to whatever that thing is, and Paul said that's not what it is at all. This is simply showing respect. Showing the person that I say, the gospel is for you, Jesus loves you. Why don't I show you that I think that you have value as a person? That I respect you, that I care about where you're at. Don't you think that would make it a little more effective when I start talking about Jesus? So why do some people refuse? Why did some people in Paul's day refuse? Why do some people in the world today refuse to consider the background, the culture of the person they're trying to share the gospel with? The easiest reason, the most obvious reason is pride. We're just not willing to do it. I won't bend for anyone. That's a pride problem. The second reason might be that you don't really have empathy or compassion for that person. Not willing to go an extra mile or even an extra few feet. And thirdly, some people just don't understand that the gospel has made us free, that these things do not have power, and it is okay to meet someone where they are because we are not under the law, we are not under these cultural things. We've been set free by the gospel. So Paul says, that's how I act around my fellow Jews. But what about the other situation? What about the flip side? He says, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. There might be a little bit of confusion about this. He said, I'm not under the law of Moses. I'm not trying to be saved by obeying the law of Moses. But that doesn't mean that the word of God is not binding upon me. That doesn't mean that I don't follow what God has said. He wants to make sure people understand the distinction. So how did Paul act when he was around the Gentiles? Most of them were followers of pagan religions, worshippers of Greek and Roman gods and various other ones. They had extremely different social habits from the strict observant Jews that Paul was raised with. They are apples and oranges in many ways. So Paul says, you know what? I'll bend to them too. I will do what they need in order for them to feel comfortable when I'm with them. He doesn't give us any examples here, but I think we can narrow it down a little bit and kind of get an idea. One thing that we know Paul didn't do was he didn't go to services at the pagan temple. He didn't participate in their religious practices. That's a very difficult question. How do we show respect for someone who is Hindu or Muslim or something without actually participating in that worship together? That's a difficult line to draw, and people struggle with it. But Paul would have made that distinction. Notice when he was in Athens, he looked at their idols. He was curious about them, because he wanted to understand them. But we do know that Paul ate with them. You might not think that's a very big deal, but his fellow observant Jews would never have done that. We don't sit down to a meal with Gentiles. They just wouldn't do it. Paul says, I'll do that. I'll go to their house. I'll eat what they're eating. If they have ham, then he probably ate it because he wants them to be comfortable with him so that they'll listen to him. And we also know from that same passage in Athens that he was willing to tailor the focus of his gospel message to the audience. He didn't talk about idols to a Jewish audience, but when he went to Athens and he stood in front of all of those philosophers, not only did he talk about their idols, but he quoted one of their philosophers. He showed them respect by talking about the things that mattered to them. The next example, Paul says, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. He doesn't mean the physically weak or the infirm. He's talking about what he was referring to in the previous chapter, about people that don't understand the difference between liberty and the law. He says to them, those that are stuck thinking that these cultural rules are actually moral rules, I will help them as well by going where they are. Even though Paul knew that those rules didn't have any real power, he would rather meet them where they are. So instead of telling someone who is struggling with that kind of issue, the issue that he referenced a chapter ago was meat offered to idols. Can we buy that in the marketplace if it was butchered at the temple of Athena, for example? Paul said, go ahead and if you want, because that idol is just a piece of stone. But Paul said, some of my fellow Christians don't understand that, and they struggle with that. So if they are struggling with it, I won't eat. I'll be fine. It won't hurt me any. Rather than criticizing them and saying, you guys are idiots, you should understand this, Paul says, I will work with them because, and this is the important part, I sympathize with where they are. I have compassion on them. And so for the sake of the gospel, I will meet them where they are. Here's his summary of this. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. Notice we had all 3 times ending in some. Paul said, I will go as far as I can go, all, just to save some. All things to all people. This is the heart of the matter. It's an interesting question. How little accommodation is too little? How much is too much? How far is too far? We know we can't change the gospel. What can we do to its presentation to meet people where they are? That's an important question. Matthew Henry wrote a couple hundred years ago, he said this, Paul would not sin against God to save the soul of his neighbor, but he would very cheerfully and readily deny himself. Paul said the law of God is the law of God, but I don't care about my pride. I don't care about me having to bend, me having to meet people where they are. Paul was not a hypocrite about that at all. He wasn't a two-faced person, right? One person to one group and one person to another. He was actually more of a chameleon. He fit in where he was so that the people would hear him. Paul was willing to set Paul aside in order to be Christ to the people that he was speaking with. He remembered the words of John the Baptist, he must become greater, I must become less. So let me give you what I think is a parallel to this situation. The kind of thing that we think about and do all the time, but for some reason, some people aren't willing to do this when they're sharing the gospel. Let me give you a for instance. For instance, I am making plans to take Nicole out for a date. We are going to go out and we're going to do something as a date. And I am the one choosing the plans. And I have 4 options for this evening. I will list them and you tell me what you think is the right choice here. The first thing that we could do would be to go to a Pirates game when they're playing the Tigers. The second thing we could do would be to go down to Pittsburgh and go to the ballet or the opera. The third thing we could do would be to go to a monster truck show. And the fourth thing we could do would be to take a road trip down to Gettysburg to look at the Gettysburg historical battlefield. Anybody know which one of those is the right choice if I want Nicole to be happy? If you think it's Monster Truck Rally, I'd have to introduce you to my wife. You are wrong. The last one, going to Gettysburg, that's me. All right, we went to Gettysburg on our honeymoon. Actually, we went to places she wanted to. We took turns. I spent the whole day fascinated. I could have been there for 3 days. She went, how long are we going to stand here and look at a field? But I'm thinking, but that's where Pickett's, never mind, right? It's not working. Now, the Pirates game is not bad. We're kind of sort of meeting in the middle. She can tolerate sports, but you know that she would rather go to the opera or to the ballet or the symphony. What? Oh, I'm sorry, I fell asleep. It's hard for me, but it's what she wants. So it depends on what I'm trying to accomplish here, huh? Do I want her to be happy? You all have been down that road before, right? When you were dating, when you were being dated, I guess, on the other side of it, you find the thing that you think the other person's going to enjoy. And then as you get married and you grow together, hopefully you find a few things that you guys do together. I know that Dan and Kathy love to go to Pirates games together. They both enjoy that. It's a win-win. Everybody's situation is different, right? There might be, I don't know, there might be a woman or two in this audience for whom the Monster Truck Rally is the place to go. Not my wife, but maybe one of you. There might even be one of you who would love to go walk around Gettysburg with me and talk about the battle. Probably not, but maybe. We're all different. And the only way that we are going to know what the right approach with the gospel is if you get to know the person you're trying to reach. When I first met Nicole, I wouldn't have known which one of those four was the right one. Right? Just walking down the hallway. The first day I saw her, walking down the hallway at Saranac High School where she was teaching, didn't know who she was. I wouldn't have known what to do, but I know her now. And that's the same thing with the gospel. When we know the people we're trying to reach, we can figure out how to approach them with the gospel. Paul says, all possible means that I might save some. Might. Paul didn't have any illusions that it was up to him. He didn't believe that it was in his hands to bring people to Jesus Christ. He knew that it was the power of the Holy Spirit that would bring people to God. But he said, I know also that God chose to work through me. He appointed him as an apostle to the Gentiles. He sent him because he wanted him to be the messenger. And so Paul says, I have an important role to play here. I need to do whatever I can do. And then it's in the hands of God. Far be it from me to be the stumbling block in the way of someone coming to Jesus. So how effective was Paul's strategy? He did this. We know he did this. When he was with the Jews, he followed their customs. When he was with the Gentiles, he followed their customs. How effective was his strategy? Well, I'll tell you this. It was more effective than had Paul ignored the issue completely. And Paul had remained the same guy in every situation, right? One size fits all. This is me. I will act this way in every situation. I will talk this way in every situation. I don't care who I'm with. I'm just me. He was more effective than that. And he was a lot more effective than the version that says, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, your culture is bad, your customs are bad, where you're from is bad, the accusatory guy, the jerk, we would call him. That guy's not getting anyone for the gospel because all that you do is offend people before they even hear what the message is. Ever know a Christian like that? You know any? I've seen them. I used to see a guy around where I grew up. He sometimes went to college campuses with a big sign saying all the things that God hates. And he would stand on the street corner and yell at people that they were evil. How effective do you think that message is? Maybe 1 in 5,000 people would stop in their tracks and go, oh my gosh, he's talking to me, and I see it. But the other 4,999 wanted to throw something at him. And people would stop and yell back at him. Effective? No. That's the opposite of the approach that the Apostle Paul is asking us to do here. Last bit. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Why does Paul go through all this effort? Why does he try so hard to get people to hear the gospel by getting other things out of the way? Because he cares about the lost. Because he himself knows what it was like to be saved by the power of God, to have his life changed. Because Paul feels indebted to God for saving him. Because Paul wants to glorify God by bringing more people into the kingdom. You see, Paul had two very important things together. He had both compassion and passion. Compassion for the lost, passion for the gospel. And putting the two of them together, he said, I will do all of this for the sake of the gospel. And I hope you're thinking as you sit there this morning about the people in your life. Is there something you can do to meet that person, that coworker, that family member, where they are, to talk about things that they care about, to experience things with them that they care about, so that you can build the relationship so that they might listen to you. When you say to them, I am who I am because of Jesus Christ, or some other way you want to put that. Paul says that I might share in its blessings. And this is our last thought, to be part of the transformation process of another human being, to walk with them and watch them go from being a stranger or even an enemy to being part of the family of God. To be a part of that process is an amazing, amazing and rewarding blessing. Something any one of us should want to be a part of. So what do you take from this as you walk away? 3 reminders. Number 1, that our approach to evangelism needs to be humble, it needs to be passionate, and it needs to be flexible. Secondly, for the sake of the gospel, we need to put the lost first. When we're talking about evangelism, outreach, missions, our own conversations, you need to put the person we're trying to reach in the front so that we can figure out how to do it right. And then thirdly, to effectively adapt the gospel presentation, and we do need to do it, without changing the gospel, that's a challenge. And sometimes people go too far. Sometimes they don't go far enough. It is hard. We need to think, we need to reason, we need to talk. But it's absolutely the task that we've been given. We've been entrusted with it. And like the Apostle Paul, we need to try. We need to try for the sake of the lost.